everyone, it's Miss Hanan. We are going to do some work on our graphic organizers, the scientific method graphic organizers. We worked on this in class, but I want to really make sure you have this down packed because it's pretty important for the Regents examinations. If you recall, we were given several scenarios. We had scenario 1 all the way down to scenario 9. I gave them to your tables. You worked in groups and you each got to choose the scenario of your choice. I'm going to do a scenario today, and I'm going to do several scenarios, and I'm going to post them one at a time, maybe a few tonight, a few tomorrow, etc. And we're going to work on basically figuring out by reading the paragraph, what's the problem here? What is the hypothesis, which is basically what is your educated guess? And you're going to have to state your hypothesis using this formula right over here. The formula is if IV, then DV. If independent variable, then dependent variable. And if you recall, I always said I'm going to type this down right here. The independent variable is basically what the scientist controls. And let's go all the way here, right under it. The dependent variable is the data you're collecting. I've asked you to put this down in your notes over and over again. I just want to make sure you remember because it's super, super important. You're going to figure out the hypothesis. You're going to figure out the independent variable and the dependent variable. And then what's the constant? What do you keep the same? Because if you recall, remember we watched a video where a woman did all of this exercise. She also took a weight loss pill. She lost 10 pounds in 3 weeks, and she couldn't really figure out what the reason for her weight loss was because she had two different variables, the weight loss pill and the exercise. So we said when you conduct an experiment, you need one single variable. One single variable. She needed to be doing only the weight loss pill or only the exercise. That's how you really figure out what the cause of the weight loss is. And after we figure out that, we're going to write the experimental design. What's the control group? What's the experimental group? And then write down an explanation. So let's decide which scenario we're going to start out with. I think we're going to start out with scenario 3. Quite a few of you use scenario 3. So I'm going to read it with you. We're going to focus on what sentence really tells us what the problem is. It's always the problem or what's the question that we want to answer. Okay, so let's go back to scenario 3. A student wants to bake the biggest loaf of bread in the local baking contest. Each contestant must use the same amount of flour, sugar, and yeast, but is allowed to vary the type of sugar. Yeast is a microorganism that carries out cellular respiration, which produces carbon dioxide, making the bread rise. The student designs an experiment using 3 different setups to determine which sugar source, glucose, sucrose, or fructose, will cause the yeast to produce the most carbon dioxide and therefore the biggest loaf of bread. So, what's the problem here? The problem is which sugar will cause you to bake the biggest loaf of bread. Here we go. This is our problem. Which sugar will cause you to bake the biggest loaf of bread? Let's go here and write our problem. Which sugar will cause you to bake the biggest loaf of bread? Okay, we wrote it in question form. Okay, let's go back to our scenario. Now we want to have a hypothesis. If, then. So for our hypothesis, we can start by picking any one of them, really. we're scientists. We're going to pick one variable at a time. We can say, I think I'm going to try the glucose first, or I think I'm going to try the sucrose first, or the fructose. So I say, it says here, the student designs an experiment using 3 different setups to determine which sugar source, glucose, sucrose, or fructose, will cause the yeast to produce the most carbon dioxide and therefore the biggest loaf of bread. So let's start. Which setup do we want to start with? Let's say we're going to start with glucose. So let's look at our hypothesis, okay? So our hypothesis is going to be, if we add, which one did we say we were going to add? We said we were going to add glucose. If we add glucose, we will bake the bread size will increase. If we, why is it being highlighted like that? Let's not highlight. No highlighting. If we add glucose, the bread size will be the biggest. You could have also said, if we add glucose, the bread size will increase. There are many ways to state this, obviously. So you notice we said if you state your hypothesis correct, it's independent variable, add glucose. If independent variable, then dependent variable, bread size will be the biggest, dependent variable. And if you want to double check yourself, you ask yourself, do I really have the right dependent variable? The dependent variable is supposed to be the data you're collecting. Is this the data that I'm collecting? Yes, it is, because the data that you're collecting, when you bake the bread, the data that you're collecting every time you bake a loaf of bread is the size of the bread. So yes, you are correct. The dependent variable is the size of the bread. So if I add glucose, the bread size will increase. The bread size will be bigger. Let's change this to bigger. I like bigger better. Okay, so our independent variable we decided is adding glucose, the glucose. Our dependent variable is bread size will be bigger. Or we could just say, or bigger bread size. What's the constant? What's going to remain the same? It really basically gives that away in this paragraph. If you notice, it says each contestant must use the same amounts of sugar, of flour, sugar, and yeast, right here. Same amounts of flour, sugar, and yeast. You're using different types of sugar. Some contestants are using glucose, some are using sucrose, some are using fructose, but each one must use the same amount of flour, sugar, and yeast. Let's highlight this a different color. Let's give it orange. Okay, so I'm going to take same amounts of flour, sugar, and yeast, and we're going to say that's our constant, same amounts of flour, sugar, and yeast. So now let's design the experiment. We're going to say our control group. Our control group is what you compare it with. So we've got this bread that we're baking with glucose because we think we're hypothesizing. All the hypothesis is, by the way, all a hypothesis is an educated guess. That's all a hypothesis is, an educated guess. And a scientist makes an educated guess. It turns out to be wrong. They make another educated guess, and then another, and then another. If it turned out that the glucose didn't work, they say, okay, let me go to the sucrose. The sucrose didn't work. Let me go to the fructose. That's how the scientific mind works. So we need a control group. We need something that we compare this to. We compare this glucose bread to. What kind of a control group? Well, The only control group we could possibly have to compare this bread with glucose in it is a loaf of bread with no sugar at all. So let's make our control group a loaf of, wait, I want this to go back up here. A loaf of bread with no sugar. And then we want our experimental group. We're going to explain, all we're going to say is what we decided to do in the experimental group. We're adding glucose. Adding glucose to a loaf of bread. Let's move this over. Glucose to a loaf. Adding glucose to a loaf. Let's say adding glucose. The formatting on this page is a little weird. Adding glucose to a bread loaf, okay? So we're adding glucose. The experimental has glucose added to a bread loaf. The control group has a loaf of bread with no sugar, okay? What do both groups have? We basically just said that in our constant. What do both groups have? Both groups have same amount of flour, sugar, and yeast. Now in this explanation, we're just basically writing a paragraph. That's all it is a paragraph about how we designed our experiment. And we're going to say, we hypothesized, we made a hypothesis that we would bake the largest bread by adding glucose. Our independent variable was glucose, and our dependent variable, in parentheses, the data we are collecting is the size of the bread. We kept the amount of flour, sugar, and yeast the same in both loaves. And lastly, I thought there was one more question we had to answer. Yes. How could we improve the validity and accuracy of the experiment? This is something you need to think about. How can you improve the validity and the accuracy of the experiment? Well, is the experiment as valid when you bake one loaf without sugar and one loaf with glucose as it is when you bake 10 loaves or maybe 100 loaves? So this is a possible way. Think of sample size. If you increase your sample size, you increase your validity. And by the way, what is validity? Being valid is the likelihood of being accurate, of being correct. So improving the validity is improving your chance of being correct. So increasing the sample size. In parentheses, I'm going to write baking more loaves. And then here I'm going to write, we improved the validity by baking 100 loaves without sugar and 100 loaves with glucose. There you go. You just finished your scientific method graphic organizer. Now, after we finished it, we can decide what kind of title do we want to give this. Let's look at the scenario again. So the scenario is we want to bake the biggest loaf and we're trying to decide what type, which sugar source will lead to the biggest loaf of bread. So how about the sugar source that leads the sugar source that bakes the biggest loaf of bread. And you may have chosen a completely different title, but it has to be, something right around there. The sugar source that bakes the biggest loaf of bread. And that is about it, everyone. That's about it right there. There is our scientific method graphic organizer. And you could have said, instead of your hypothesis being we're going to add glucose, it could have been we think glucose will make the bread size bigger. It could have been we think sucrose or we think fructose. And a scientist basically tests one variable at a time. If they're wrong, they go to the next variable and then the next variable. All right. Thank you for listening, everybody.